Welcome everyone to our second Gain of Discovery Dialogue series. I am your moderator today. My name is Tyler Jones. And today we will be talking about neurodiversity and creativity. When we will explore how divergent minds lead to divergent thinking and problem solving, and how this thinking outside of the box is a strength for many neurodivergent people who often thrive in entrepreneurship, music, and other creative fields. Today we are joined by our panelists in conversation about how neurodiversity often impacts creative access and expression. So please welcome, just very briefly, we've got Holly White from Outside the Box Consulting, Thomas Armstrong from the American Institute for Learning and Human Development, Ronald Bighetto from Arizona State University, and Michael Backen from Florida State University. To start off, I would like each speaker to share a bit about themselves and how they're thinking about the topic of neurodiversity and creativity. And so, Holly, let's start with you.
Thank you, Tyler. My name's Holly White, and I am a cognitive psychologist, and I'm an independent researcher, primarily doing my own research and consulting at this point, but my background is pretty varied, and I have done quite a bit in the area of teaching and digital education design and learning classroom design and such, primarily aimed at educating individuals, both children and adults, with attention deficit disorders. And what has really inspired my current interests, which are in the area of creative cognition and attention deficit disorders, is I started out with, I think, what is more the classical traditional type of research, where I looked at what is wrong with a person's mind and their thinking if they have an attention deficit disorder. So limitations in memory, limitations in cognitive processing. And in doing so, I noticed a lot of errors, which were fascinating. Things that were being done wrong were being done in a way that was amazing and cool and creative. And I thought there's a lot more to this, and it's a lot more interesting on the other side. So I started to look at, through, I think, a more theoretically grounded perspective, the same way I was looking at these deficits. I was thinking, well, okay, how are these different things coming together to actually facilitate areas of functioning that are positive areas? How can this actually be maybe an enhancement, not just something where there are no deficits, but there are actually strengths? And that's what brought me around to looking at ADD or ADHD as potentially a place of creative strengths in the context of neurodiversity.
Thank you, Holly. Tom, how about you next?
First, a disclaimer. I am not affiliated with Stanford Medical School. I was speaking at a conference last month, and they put this background on me, and I don't know how to get it off, but I will someday. I am focused as an educator. That's really my background. I have a doctoral degree in psychology, but my interest in neurodiversity has its roots probably in the 1970s when I was a special education teacher. And I noticed that I had a lot of amazing kids in my special classes. You know, kids that were, one held the national record for the breaststroke in his age group. Another one was a national modeling person for a national department store. Another one was actually a psychic child who could read numbers from a dictionary 3 doors down. I had artists, I had writers, and yet all of these kids were being considered, the term they were using at the time was educationally handicapped. And I later learned that that was probably a good label because they were disabled by the education they were receiving. They were worksheet disabled, they were lecture dysfunctional, and their gifts were not being looked at. And so that immediately made me feel quite antagonistic, I guess you will, to the special education system. And I've been that way ever since. In the 80s, I discovered Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, the idea that there's 8 intelligences instead of just one. And it helped me understand how a person could be good in one intelligence and not so good in another. And so that was very useful. And I did a lot of teaching and consulting and so forth. But then in the 2000s, I discovered neurodiversity.com. It's now neurodiversity.net, and it's not really available for new things. But that site really electrified me because it had the slogan honoring the varieties of human wiring. And I thought, yes, yes, this explains my students and why they're differently wired and how they don't fit into the traditional classroom context, but they fit into lots of other contexts that are actually more real in the real world than school is. And so I began writing, and I wrote a couple of books, The Power of Neurodiversity and Neurodiversity in the Classroom. I began doing seminars and workshops, and the movement has really taken off in the last 20 years or 12 years since I first wrote my book. And so I'm really excited to see what we're going to cook up here in this seminar.
Thanks, Tom. And then I think we'll go to Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Tyler. And it's really an honor to be on this panel with all these amazing people and amazing thinkers. So how I enter into this, I'm an ethnomusicologist, big fancy word, which essentially means that as a musician, as an ethnographer, a scholar, and a generally curious person who, wants to do some good in the world, I'm interested in how people make and experience music and in why it matters to them that they do. And the to them part is very important. So whether those people happen to be gamelan musicians on the island of Bali in Indonesia, which was the focus of my earlier research in my first book, or autistic kids playing free improvisatory music with one another, their non-musician parents, and a bunch of top-tier professional musicians from around the world in a specially designed exploratory world music playground, or as we call it, the EWOMP. The goal is essentially the same. I want to meet these really interesting, really dedicated, musicking people where they are, to do so on their terms rather than mine or ours, to make music together with them, assuming that they invite me to do that, and to learn from them about what matters to them and why. But one of the interesting things that happened in the trajectory of this work is that I had been doing that for a long time with Balinese gamelan musicians, going back to the late 1980s, and had, done a dissertation, written a book, and so on and so forth. And so I was working on the ethnomusicology of gamelan music. And when I would present on that work, or people would ask me questions, it was always like, oh, well, what are the, the cultural symbols in the music? What are the sort of value systems of the Balinese culture that are informed by these kinds of things? But then due to a shift in my life, a dramatic shift in my life, which maybe will come up later, I became an ethnomusicologist of autism. And there was no such thing as that before I essentially invented it. But then the interesting thing was I was doing basically the same kind of work, but people were asking, oh, what sort of interventions are you dealing with? What kind of deficits are you addressing? What kind of outcomes are you seeing? And I thought, this doesn't make sense. And so I realized that it was the same thing, that either way, what I'm trying to do is to understand from their perspective. So from that vantage point, the next step is to help bring these people's knowledge, their wisdom, their modes of creative expression and agency to broad public view and attention, and to get other people to know that these people that I've come to know well, that other people should also know them as the creative and social and intelligent and empathic and compassionate and fun to be with, and often really funny people who they are. So that's kind of what I do.
And Ron, let's end with you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. And I'm Ron Baguetto. I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm a professor at Arizona State University. I study human creativity and the possible in educational settings. And the way I think about creativity and neurodiversity is context matters. And so we've kind of heard this in some of the opening remarks, as Tom said as well. And the reason why context matters is because creativity is always contextually defined. It has two kind of key facets. The first is thinking, experiencing, acting different, or producing novel, original, unique ideas and things. But that's only half the story. The second facet, somewhat paradoxically, is that creativity also involves constraints. It's constrained by contextual expectations, affordances, goals, task demands, and so on. So these can include both internal or subjective kind of constraints and also, of course, external constraints, as Tom mentioned. We'll talk about education in a second here. So creativity is, one way to think about it is it's constrained originality. Now, neurodiverse folks think and experience the world in different ways, and that is a key strength when it comes to creativity. I think folks are realizing that now, that is in fact a strength. However, much depends on the context, whether the context recognizes, supports, and helps enable this strength. And in educational settings, for example, there are many, many constraints, namely predetermined expectations, which are fine, and people can be creative in those contexts, but there's often this kind of added, and I would say unnecessary layer of expectations, which is there are expectations for how expectations will be met. In other words, young people are asked, not only this is how you need to do something, but this is what you will do. So there's this kind of conspires against the creativity, because creativity involves meeting expectations in different ways. And so if young people or neurodiverse folks in those settings are not allowed to meet expectations in different ways, then that kind of curtails creativity. So as a result, all those unique perspectives and ideas of neurodivergent folks and many other folks in those settings, including teachers, often go unheard and result in them feeling isolated, dismissed, and alienated. But there is hope. And I think one area of kind of exciting hope in the age of AI is generative AI. And I really think it can help establish new possibilities for neurodiverse folks as partners in creative possibility thinking. So not only to help them navigate, but creatively contribute in and beyond educational context. So I'm looking forward to where this panel discussion goes, and I'll turn it back over to Tyler.
Thanks, Tom. And so I think from all of these intros, I think there's been one like defining or unifying thread of context, and the context of creativity and neurodiversity. There is a question in our Q&A on if anyone from the panel is neurodiverse, and you do not have to disclose that. But I will say that as a neurodiverse person myself, a lot of what you guys have been talking about has hit home, especially Tom, with the expectations on how you will meet expectations. And like
that was Ron that said that.
I'm so sorry, Ron. You're right, Tom. I'm like looking right at your name in Zoom, and so I am getting distracted. But even with the expectations on how expectations can be met is especially constraining in the context of I have to get through school, I have to get through work. But I think there were maybe some things we could clarify again. So maybe Holly, when we say like neurodiversity, could you give like a quick definition of sort of what we mean by that, and kind of what do those differences mean for our thinking and creativity?
Okay. I'm not sure that we have a standardized definition, but I will say that it maybe comes from a bit of reframing of things that maybe traditionally have been seen as disorders. At least from my perspective, when I'm thinking about attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or so many other things that we define in terms of diagnostic labels. If you think about the criteria for something being, say, a mental disorder, then you think, well, it has to be abnormal, meaning like atypical or not normal. You can think of it in terms of just maybe less frequent. Well, that is sort of the diversity part, in the sense that, okay, you have a difference here. You have something that's maybe a little outside the norm. That's kind of a neutral thing. That's not necessarily good or bad. Then the second criteria with respect to a mental disorder would be that it is maladaptive. And here's where context is key, of course. And then before I go on there, I'd say thirdly, that it's distressing to the individual. So just looking at something like attention deficit disorder or something like that, if you break it down and you might think, okay, a person who has, and firstly, our brains are all more alike than they are different in the sense that we have pretty much the same anatomy going on there and physiology for the most part for most tasks. However, there's still a great deal of variation in how we approach different activities and our strengths and our limitations. And so if you define the middle part, the context, in a certain way, then that's where you start to find some people are better suited to that context than others. And here's where you would take the people who maybe are, but you say, okay, there's very few people, for example, that are not going to fit in this ideal context. So they're kind of atypical and they're maladaptive because they don't fit in this particular one size fits all context. And probably because of all that, they're distressed. So instead of, you maybe would frame it in terms of, let's call the atypicality more of a diversity. The neuro refers to the brain and all that good stuff. And if you're framing it in terms of context, then it's not by definition positive or negative. It really depends on what you're talking about, right? So I'd say that if you were talking about, say, being left-handed or right-handed, there are more people who are right-handed than left-handed. So by the typicality definition, it's abnormal to be left-handed. That's not really going to pose a limitation unless maybe you're trying to use a right-handed pair of scissors. But let's say that's the case and everything is so right-handed that you find yourself stumbling along if you happen to be left-handed. It's just, it's arbitrary and it's something that's imposed by our societal expectations of what normal behavior and adaptation mean. And so if I'm talking about a context like creativity, and again, that, you know, as the panel can speak to, that is also a very big word. But let's just say, when I'm looking at attention deficits, I'm interested in the types of creative cognitive processes that lead to thinking of things in a very original, different sort of way or expansive way, which is not to say it's not also important to be able to refine those ideas and develop them. Of course it is. However, in the context of brainstorming, some of those aspects of, let's say, ADD or ADHD that can cause problems if your context is to sit still and to think in a linear way, well, those same processes might be advantageous if the goal is to think outside the box or think in a way that's very different or expansive or being distracted. So in order to define what is good or bad in any particular situation is context dependent. And if you set up a situation in which a certain type of thinking is expected and you are measured against that, then it's just going to kind of automatically be focused on the negative component. So I think that neurodiversity is a way of framing differences in how we think as something that is not necessarily negative and may also be positive. So it's not saying, okay, there are no negative things. It's not dismissing the fact that somebody who is different may have real challenges in certain contexts. It's simply a choice to focus also on using some of the strengths that are inherent in that difference, and maybe even leveraging those strengths to adapt for some of the weaknesses, appreciating the strengths so that others will be motivated to see how we can use these things. And then also to question our idea of what kind of context are we creating where we don't allow all these different minds to thrive. Perhaps we need to think about that too, you know. And then with respect to the last part, the distress and how upsetting something is, that's a big part, I think, of the framing and how things are presented and the opportunities that someone is given. So I guess that's where it kind of coming up. That's my understanding, I think, of this as a way of reframing some intellectual variations. And while we all think differently, there are some extremes in certain types of thinking that have been characterized as disorders. And in some contexts, I think you could go with that. In the things that I study, I tend to find the ADHD, ADD thing a good thing. And I don't, in fact, when I talk about it as disorder, I'll sometimes say it's this disorder that makes it very difficult to pay attention to things that are not inherently interesting.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
I
agree.
I suffer terribly from that. I admit, I find it very difficult to put in effort to something that I am not motivated to do. Shame on me. Well, there you have it. Again, it depends. There are times we have to pay attention, and I get it. But we also maybe need to redefine some of these concepts. So
Right. I think of neurodiversity in terms of getting people to think about brain differences in the same way they think about biodiversity and cultural diversity. If you said, let's celebrate cultural diversity, people go, yeah, that's great. You know, we learn so much from different cultures. But you say, well, how about these brain differences? Well, that's a matter for the DSM, you know, and to see what disorder they fit in and all that kind of thing. But no, we got to clear that table away and just start to have the attitude. I've said to people, you don't say a calla lily has pedal deficit disorder. You appreciate the calla lily for what it is, you know, and we should do the same with human differences and brain differences. You also asked us if we were willing to disclose our neurodiversity, and mine is a mood disorder, which often isn't reflected in discussions on neurodiversity, but I have unipolar depression. I've had 5 episodes in my life of major depression. Thankfully, I haven't had one for the last 14 years. And I think it's partly because I've learned some of the tricks, some of the positive, I use the term niche construction, like a beaver building a dam or a spider spinning a web. It's what kind of environment can we create for ourselves that will maximize our assets and minimize our problems. And so I've managed over the years to create, to use Holly's sense word, context, creating contexts that work for me, like working on my own at home. I like to travel. I don't like to fly. That's another one of my neurodiversities. But I manage that with Ativan, crossword puzzles, and music. But at any rate, you wanted to know some of our neurodiversities, and that's mine.
Thank you for that. And Tom, I'll actually just ask you one more question. And in speaking about the different contexts that we can make for ourselves and just kind of just make for a more neurodiverse world, how do those go into, you mentioned Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences.
Yeah. Well, Gardner's theory says that there's 8 intelligences, including music smart, people smart, number smart, logic smart, body smart, nature smart, self smart, and some other kind of smart. I might have left it out. But the idea is, and Gardner says intelligence is basically the ability to solve problems and fashion products. And so when you look at that kind of definition, you're not looking at IQ tests as the arbiter of what intelligence is. You're looking at things like, how warm is a person? How personable are they? And in fact, people with Down syndrome, for example, are tremendously personable in that respect. We look at picture smart as the ability to, visualize, to create things through art or through architecture. You've got a lot of people with the label dyslexia. This is what I found in my classrooms, that if a child was dyslexic, oftentimes he was really good at art. And that is because it was in a totally different area of the brain. It was in a different intelligence. So Gardner's 8 intelligences really opened me up to the fact that, these diversities that we look at primarily in terms of negatives now can be viewed within the context of these intelligences or some other positive, affirming, asset perceiving model.
Thank you. And this would be a question for everybody from our Q&A. And I think this is along the same lines of these contexts. And so the question is cultural utility, does cultural utility also determine whether neurodiverse creativity is considered disordered or not?
What do you mean by cultural utility?
I will, from my understanding of the question, I'm reading it cultural utility as, I guess, usefulness to community, usefulness to the community. I also kind of read it as whether it fits within the specific context that you are looking in, as in, I'm thinking of creativity, maybe with with music, maybe very fantastic, in a musical context, but drumming on like a desk, probably not as conducive to, an environment that is for, I don't know, quiet, sitting down, silently and sitting still.
Well, as a drummer, I'll take that one. And actually, this goes back to something I alluded to in my opening remarks. I think cultural utility is actually a wonderful phrase from which to approach this issue. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that when I was an ethnomusicologist of Balinese gamelan music, that generated one set of assumptions and questions from people who were audiences of my work, whether in giving talks, playing music, reading publications of mine, or whatever. In the ethnomusicology of autism side, it was entirely different. And so if we wanted to kind of understand what this would be like, putting it in reverse, I want to go back to Thomas's idea. Well, we all accept cultural diversity as a great thing. Of course, that hasn't always been the case, and one would venture to say it certainly isn't always the case anymore, unfortunately. But just as an example, if I were an ethnomusicologist living in our times when cultural diversity is assumed to be, at least arguably, something of an attribute, and I were to go to Bali, and just a very quick primer. So gamelan music, there is no conductor. The drummer is the director of the ensemble, right? The tuning is different from ours. Rather than tuning to a single frequency like A440, as we would do, with a piano or an orchestra or something, all of the instruments are tuned in pairs so that one is intentionally lower than the other so that they oscillate with these acoustical beats of 6 to 7 oscillations per second. And it's that vibration called ombak, or wave, which gives the music life. But if we were to go in with our assumptions about how music is supposed to work in terms of our expectations on how they'll meet the expectations, to refer back to Ron, then I would come in perhaps and say, let me help you out here, gamelan musicians in Bali. I think you could really function a lot more effectively if we brought in a conductor, so that the drummer could focus just on drumming and not have to worry about leading the orchestra at the same time. And I have this great piano tuner who I'm going to bring in and fix up your instruments here so that they're all properly in tune. And we could go on with all kinds of different examples of all those kinds of things. And of course, if I were to do that as an ethnomusicologist, I mean, I would lose my license, right? I would lose my job. I mean, that would be absolutely sacrilege. Yet that's exactly the kind of thing that people did, not that long ago, decades, maybe a century ago, when they were, missionaries or other people going in to tell people how to civilize themselves and so on and so forth. Now, hopefully, we've learned and we've changed. So basically, that has been my assumption of how to work with the cultural utility of Balinese gamelan musicians, that I assume they are the world's leading experts at being who they are, which means they're the world's leading experts at being Balinese, at being musicians, at being Balinese musicians, at playing gamelan, understanding the value systems that all those things, connect around. And similarly, when I go into the EWAMP, this exploratory world music playground, my assumption is the same. These kids, they're the world's leading experts at being who they are, at being musicians, at being creative, at being autistically musical, however that frames it. And so my job is to learn from them. But if we define cultural utility in terms of norms, going back to Holly's example, right-handed, left-handed, and then all the left-handed people are wrong and disordered, and which of course also historically was the case. then we marginalize those people and we exclude them from the possibilities of a reasonable life. A word that came up from a family conversation years ago, I was talking about some of these things, you know, around the dinner table, and one of my kids said, disenabling instead of disabling. And suddenly my wife, who's a cognitive psychologist, and we sort of looked at each other and said, that's it. That's what societies do. That's what institutions do. We disenable people. And we disenable neurodivergent people, and we disenable physically different people. And so we need to get away from disenabling and move more towards enabling to make cultural utility a more, you know, birthright experience for everyone.
From my perspective in education, the traditional classroom is a disabling condition for most students. There are a few whom we call gifted and talented who do quite well and enjoy the experience. But I think that we disenable kids when they enter that classroom, and the so-called normal kids are the ones who manage to learn the games and the routines and the rituals and the tricks and the tips to be able to survive in that environment. And the ones that we label learning disabled, ADHD, autistic, are the ones that either can't or won't learn those tricks, and it becomes disenabling for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a couple quick comments. First, going back to, I love where this panel discussion is leading, and going back to kind of disclosing our own neurodiversities. I would say I describe myself as attention divergent. So I reject attention deficit. I don't think it's a deficit, and I reject the disorder. So it's just AD, attention divergent. And I see it as perspectival. From my perspective, and my daughter, who also has been labeled with ADD or ADHD, from the perspective of the person who is neurodivergent with that particular kind of label or trait, there's no deficit, there's no attention that's lacking. Attention is happening. It's just from the perspective of whomever else, i.e. a teacher or a parent or whomever, they're not paying attention to what the other people expect them to pay attention to, or want them to, or need them to pay attention to. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And that helps, again, understand context. And that kind of segues into creativity and this idea of like utility or useful for whom. And so my colleague, James Kaufman, and I, we developed the 4C model of creativity. And because we use the definition of creativity throughout all the 4 Cs, at the subjective level, which we call mini C creativity, not to diminish it, but to say it is a subjective experience of doing something new and personally meaningful, that in its own right is creative expression. And it's as legitimate as any kind of legendary experience. And even kind of creative eminent folks have mini C experiences all the time. Some of them choose to put those into the world and others don't. Nikola Tesla did many creative thought experiences. If you read the autobiography, did many creative thought experiments, but never shared them with the world, right? Those were just resolved the problems in his own mind. And that was just a meaningful, powerful creative experience. So it brings in the notion of audience. And there are times when those ideas could benefit the world, and we want to encourage young people or adults or whomever to share their different ideas. And it's through feedback that we can help them maybe connect to, like, how does that connect with what we're doing right now? How does that connect with the class discussion if we're going to use education? Or how does that advance the field of science? And so those different C's move out from the kind of subjective experience to external audiences. So little C creativity is the everyday audience. When you put together leftovers in a creative way and your family doesn't reject it, and they say, this is a new way of blending these things, that's everyday creative. Would a professional chef say that's a creative dish? Maybe, but probably not. So professional creativity is the next level, and that usually requires some intense domain expertise or extended experiences, where others in the field would say, wow, that's really shifted the way we think about ADHD or neurodiversity, right? So that's happening in these kinds of, at that level of conversation. And then there's legendary creativity, or big C, and that's usually bestowed upon people after they're dead. Like, wow, this person really changed the way we think about this in this domain and across domains. But to the point of there is so much creativity happening in the way neurodiverse folks experience the world. And some of that can be beneficial to the world. And so part of it is about feedback. And that's where I see kind of generative AI is serving as this kind of feedback partner that doesn't come in with these kind of preconceived expectations. I mean, they are kind of fine-tuned, so they are going to give you some kind of preconceived expectations, but they're not going to roll their eyes at you. They're not going to get tired. They're going to constantly work with you and your ideas, and in some cases help folks that have a very divergent idea connect it in a way that other people might be able to understand it. And on the flip side of that, somebody who has a very standard idea, it might nudge you to come up with a more original take on that idea. And so I've developed a series of bots that kind of is meant to do that, to support either kind of helping you connect it to a way that makes it feasible or understandable for others, but also to push you to be more original if you're just giving something that's pretty standard.
That's great.
Yeah, fascinating.
Let me see. Sorry, it's the ADHD guys.
I was just wanted to dovetail off of what Ronald just said. We can think of then AI in terms of universal design for learning, which are the tools, many of them tech-oriented, that enable people with neurodiversities to get things done, to not allow obstacles to determine who they are, and to keep them from expanding into their potential beyond the obstacle. And so that was my first reaction, that, my first good reaction about AI was that, hey, this could be a really good tool for neurodivergent people.
No, I think to dovetail off of your dovetail, Tom, so with some of your thoughts on educators and policy leaders, could you tell us about sort of the directions that they could go in kind of fostering, facilitating, just at least enabling creativity in those contexts?
Well, I think they need to totally overhaul the field of special education, at least in the United States, because it's really founded. And if you look at the history, some of its pioneers were Henry Goddard, who is famous for creating the word moron, and who was a eugenicist. I think they have their feet too ensconced in that sort of quicksand. What they need is a strength-based system. We need to have special ed teachers who do their doctoral research on the strengths of kids with neurodivergent differences. We need to empower them to use positive assessments, things like the Torrance Test of Creative Abilities, or the VIA, Virtues in Action, or the Developmental Assets Model, or there's a whole bunch of instruments out there, but when you go into a typical special education environment, you'll find all kinds of, the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities. My favorite, it was the RAT. When I was a special educator, we were supposed to give the RAT, which it was the Wide Range Achievement Test, but it really felt like we were giving them the RAT. So yes, we need to, in terms of inclusion, I think that special ed should be totally inclusive, and that teachers should be able to develop students' abilities by using their strengths to help them with something that's a difficulty. That should just be like, it's second nature to them. And there are a lot of other things that I do, but right off, I'd say, get into a strength-based perspective. And the IDEA Act, the federal act, actually makes it a federal requirement for a special needs kid to have their strengths addressed. So it's in the law, but most educators, on the forms that they do, they have a little 2 sentences. Student works well, student perseveres. And what does that tell me? It tells me that they're, they're barely surviving. They're barely got their head above water. Is that what that tells me? And so, yeah, strength-based, affirmative approaches to seeing kids in totally new ways. And that will make them easier to include, by the way. When a teacher sees that someone is coming into the classroom with all these negative labels, it's like, oh, I can't deal with this. I've got too many already. But if they have a child coming in who's got this ability, can draw, can peer tutor really well, is a football genius, that makes it exciting. I want to have somebody like that in my classroom.
And I'll open that up to the rest of the panelists as well, on your thoughts on how we can make kind of life for neurodivergence and the creativity that they come with less disenabling, to take that term.
I just actually wanted to quickly follow up to what you had said, Tom. It makes me think too of, well, this timing is perfect for us to talk about making major changes in education, given the digital revolution. And one thing that I had most recently, I think, told my college students, and I don't know how much they like me saying this, but I said, guys, I mean, you want to make sure that you are able to think critically and that you're able to do something that's unique, something that cannot be done by Alexa. I mean, you know, we love our AI, and yet that needs to be a complement to what we can do, and maybe take the place of just learning a bunch of material and being able to spit it back out. So I think some of the tools that we have at our disposal now certainly didn't exist back in the day when people were defining parameters of what makes a good education for everybody. So again, yeah, as Thomas had said, a lot of this stuff is really obsolete. So we kind of have to go back to the drawing board too, to say, well, what do we even care about? What is even relevant now? And then also knowing that we can't possibly anticipate all that will be useful and relevant without some experimentation and room for natural, well, what diversity essentially does, which is give an opportunity for evolution and for context interaction and identifying strengths. And so there's that. And then the other thing is that as we have had in recent years a greater recognition of people who maybe needed classroom accommodations, one of the things that I noticed among faculty is, frankly, resentment of the numbers of students coming into the classroom with lists of accommodations, because they were adding a lot of work to the burden of the instructor. And instead of saying something like, hey, this person has, you know, an amazing gift with visual materials, or wait till you see what they can draw, or, oh, you don't even know what kind of club they have after school and these things they do. Instead, it's, here's a list of what they can't do, and here's a list of the extra work that you have to do to make sure that they can do these things we all say they need to be able to do. And it's really not helpful for anybody. And instead, if you make some universal changes that actually work for so many people, and they're flexible enough tools, they introduce assets into the system in a way that's more palatable for everybody. Because you do have like, hey, wow, look who's coming into my classroom, all these different people. And then maybe one of the things too would be to include some of these learners in this conversation, because we don't necessarily know what, you know, I think identifying a person's strengths, and what I tell students is, getting to know your brain and how it works and what it can do is a huge part of your learning experience. You got, you know, it's not about what we tell you should be, it's who you are and what you can do, and what is your gift or gifts, and where can you use them. Like, find your place, find your people, find your spot, and make that happen. So if students can go in and be, and you have something that's a bit more open-ended to identify, rather than pre-select a list of items that you have to check off to see where people are good and where they need help. Instead, it's a little bit more open, and we more look at things like empathy, creativity, you know, linguistic ability, drawing, all these different skills, instead of just an antiquated list of things. And we just would much more, I think, have something organic that would arise. But it would it requires a reconceptualization, I think, of a lot of things before people will be willing to make changes. So hopefully the conversation about neurodiversity is a good starting place.
Yeah,
I have
and if I may,
something.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
After you, Ron.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So I just want to share for just 1 minute, because I think in the age of AI that there are these new possibilities for kind of doing exactly what Tom and Holly have been describing. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly and show you just, I won't show you these in action. Can you see, is it sharing now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to make this larger. But the idea here with these kind of generative AI bots, and maybe it's not bringing the whole screen up, but let's just look at these really quickly. The idea here is that individual students can on demand kind of learn their own possibilities by using these bots. These bots have been kind of steered and trained on a lot of materials and protocols that I've developed in my own research and applied work. And they can also be used by teachers who are also trying to understand, right? So kind of on-demand professional development, but also families that want to support young people. So the first one's Possibility Thinking Bot, which helps you kind of come up with what if possibilities to kind of expand the horizon of what's possible by also flipping your assumptions, helping you consider potential unintended consequences, to really think about how can we implement ideas and expand the horizon of the possible. Janus Bot is a similar, it's based on a creativity strategy where you can blend different opposites in ways to kind of emerge unique thirds, right? So, friend plus enemy is frenemy. That's a unique third. It's a very common strategy in creative thinking. So it's just a very kind of easy creative thinking bot. And by the way, these are QR codes. So I've ported these over to OpenAI so you can kind of use these if you have access to OpenAI. And Legacy Project Bot, it'll help you develop projects that can make an impact in the world now. That's a thing about education that really bothers me, is someday you can maybe use this stuff you're learning, or maybe not. But today you can take ideas and build projects that can make an impact on the learning and lives of others. And finally, Assessment for Creativity Bot is what I talked about earlier. It can help you take an original idea and anchor it so it can be feasibly implemented. But again, giving you feedback. These are not answer machines. They're dialogue bots. They're obnoxiously Socratic. I set them up that way. If you say, just tell me, it'll say, I don't give answers, but I can help you think about some questions, right? And so again, Assessment for Creativity can also take a standard idea and help you really push it out and say, can we make this a little bit more unique? So I encourage you to play with these tools, not just mine, but develop your own. And I think that that's a possibility. The thing with ChatGPT and all those things is they're too general. People are using them as search engines, but really what they should be used as a search for possibilities. And I think if you ask good questions and have a dialogue, then you can kind of expand the horizon of what's possible in and out of educational contexts for neurodiverse folks and those that are trying to support them and support their creativity.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Ron. And so in the essence of time, technically, we do have audience Q&A. And so I'll just pick a couple from our Q&A section. Going back to something that Holly mentioned, and then also with sort of the generative AI aspect of what could be a possibility in the future. Are there any other types of activities or uses, some other word is better, but I don't have it right now. Would any of you recommend for specifically like students with neurodiverse thinking to sort of maintain their attention as well as engaging their creativity and their learning? I know, Ron, you mentioned the generative AI, but is there anything further with those? And if anyone else has something to add?
Well, I think any kind of project-based learning, which is, a solid part of some educators' repertoire, if the project is based on an interest of the student, that can really unfold their possibilities in all kinds of unexpected directions. But you've got to make the project open-ended to some extent, because so many projects these days, like, I want to see this, I want to see that, I want to see this, I want to see that, and I have to check off all. That's just too onerous for neurodivergent students. And so I think, obviously guiding them, encouraging them, giving them ideas, from the AI bot uh, can really help them. But any kind of real world learning is what we're talking about. Kids are sick of being in this phony environment that they're never going to have to be in again unless they become professors. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I might just speak to that issue, or dovetail, to use the term we've been using, in terms of, I think it's really important, and especially say with autistic people, underutilized, to create opportunities for expectation-free improvisatory experience. In other words, I work in the domain of music, which, to quote one of my colleagues, especially in the sort of the conservatory environment in which I tend to operate, is a very blunt instrument. Either you are one of the 5 best people in the world who does this particular skill in this very particular way, or we have no interest in you, no room for you. And that's it's a fairly awful place for any kind of divergent or creative thinking, which is ironic because we think of music as one of the main avenues for creativity and human expression. But in the projects that I've done in the autism music ensemble and the music play project, the idea has been to turn the thing entirely upside down, so that you have world-class musicians in an ensemble with autistic kids who are not musicians, or autistic adults who are not necessarily musicians, and non-autistic adults who are the parents of the kids, or partners of the kids, or whatever. But rather than it being what you would expect would be, well, these expert, world-class musicians are coming in and teaching music to these children who, have special needs or disabilities. Instead, we come in with this idea of they are the experts, the kids are the experts. We're here at their beck and call, and we create an environment that there are lots of fun things to bang on and shake and play and whatnot. And then we just kind of open that space and allow the kids to explore it on their own terms. And we are essentially there in the kind of way, like in the video game analogy, if you have like Guitar Hero or Rock Band or something, where you can go in and you create the music, and whatever the game, it responds to your cues. Well, we're doing the same thing, but it's with live musicians. So that has a double advantage. It creates opportunities for creative expression. It also creates opportunities for social engagement, but it's done in a way that you can't lose the game. In other words, there is no outcome, there is no correct scale, there is no correct melody, there is no correct chord progression or rhythm. The job of the trained musicians is to be able to find a way to interconnect with whatever cues, however seemingly arbitrary they may be, in order to make it socially cohesive and enjoyable for all concerned, and to give a sense of encouraging the agency of these kids that, oh, if I reach out to other people, rather than being told I'm doing it wrong, or I'm inadequate, or I'm deficient, instead, I'm having these people respond to what I'm doing, take my lead, and create something beautiful or interesting or fascinating out of it. And so I think, improvisation is terribly undervalued especially in special education, music therapy, things like that. Let me correct that. There's an entire area in music therapy called improvisational music therapy. So there's a lot of work in that, but certain more constrained fields within music therapy and elsewhere, the idea of we have to define what the goal is, whether that's a musical goal or whether it's an academic goal or a social goal, that immediately kills the possibility of the reciprocity that we would like to see.
And I think we have time for one more question. And so on the same topic, as this improvisation and expectation-free creation, this question is specifically about classroom teachers. So how can classroom teachers harness the energy of embracing that unexpected in the face of sort of rigid schedules and curricula? And I think this can be kind of ported over to outside of the classroom, really to any context that necessitates a schedule and heavy external expectations.
You know, the 42-minute classroom is really, talk about constraints, but there's a model out there in education called Genius Hour. And during that time, kids can pursue a passion project, essentially. And so I'm afraid in some environments, it's going to have to be genius 42 minutes. But still, I like the idea of an oasis, giving kids an oasis sometime during the school day where all those expectations for academic accomplishment are removed and kids can actually pursue something within their own world that has value to them and probably will have value to others as well.
Yeah, and along those lines, I think it's important for us as educators to think about expectations. That when we have no expectation, I think that can be very generative. It's not low expectations and it's not overly burdensome high expectations, but let's just see what happens, right? And so then we can take our lessons that tend to be over-planned. Everything's predetermined, what to do, how to do it, what the outcome is going to look like, and the criteria for success, and engage in what I call lesson unplanning. What if you just remove one element and you just don't have any expectations for how students do it? So you say, here is the thing, how you arrive at it is up to you. Let's see what happens, right? So that's no expectation. That's lesson unplanning. Remove one element. And then to Tom's earlier point, is you start removing more and more of those pieces and say, I'm just here to support you. What if the kids came up with their own problems to solve, their own ways of solving them, and their own ways of demonstrating what they did? And so again, I think you can kind of scale that up and down in an everyday lesson. We overplan, and we do this in everything. We overplan even vacations and, meeting agendas, right? So if we can unplan a little bit and allow for improvisation, as Michael and others have been talking about, then I think we can open up room for creativity.
And in the essence of the overplanning, we are at time. Even though there are more questions to ask, I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us and our live audience. Our next Dana Discovery Dialogue is on the topic of gut-brain interactions and will be on Wednesday, December 13th from 3 to 4 Eastern Time. And we hope that all of you can join us then. And if not, there will be a recording posted onto the Dana YouTube page.